Have you ever witnessed a miracle? Have you ever seen a miracle? I know you've heard about reports of miracles. Our topic today is, what are miracles? Can it ever be rational to believe that one occurred? Notice that our topic falls into the two parts for this course. There is both the metaphysics part and the epistemology part. The metaphysics part, concerning the topic of miracles, is the question of what a miracle is. What is the nature of a miracle? Once we get that sorted out, we can turn to the question of the epistemology of miracles. Is it ever reasonable to believe that a miracle has occurred? Not surprisingly, some people doubt that you could ever reasonably believe that a miracle has occurred. And if you think about your own reaction to reports of miracles, especially from relatively conservative religious communities, I guess the ones we're most familiar with are going to be Christian groups. Think of Oral Roberts' crusades, Benny Hinn events, those sorts of things. There are multiple reports of lots of really interesting things happening at these conventions, conferences, services, revivals, tent revivals, and that sort of thing. Legs are lengthened, feeling is restored in paralyzed limbs. All sorts of things are reported to have been happening. And if you think about your own attitude toward these reports, you're probably unconvinced. The question is whether your skepticism here is warranted and generalizable. So we'll talk about whether the skepticism is warranted, but the more interesting question is, how much do you generalize this? One of the things you know about these reports and the people involved in them is this: the people involved in them and leading the groups involved in this are people that like to get donations from the people in their audiences, whether it's on television or in person. So you might think they're highly motivated. Snake oil salesmen have been around for as long as human beings have existed. You don't think that miracles have occurred when you go to magic acts. Let's postpone further discussion of the epistemology of miracles until we pay a little bit of attention to the question of what a miracle is. What is the nature of a miracle? We can begin here with David Hume. David Hume tells us a miracle is a violation of a law of nature. Notice that there are two conceptual parts of this account. First, we have this talk about laws of nature. Second, we have talk about a violation of a law of nature. Let's focus on the first part first. What is a law of nature and why are we talking about them? It's useful to begin by thinking about nature as being governed by laws and miracles as somehow standing in contrast to what's going on when the universe operates according to its laws. This may be unduly metaphorical. There are positions about the nature of the universe, the physical interactions involved in the operations of the universe, that tell us not to talk about laws of nature. There are philosophers that tell us not to talk about causation when it comes to understanding the way the world works. The most famous is Bertrand Russell, who counseled thinking about physics in terms of equations and things like that, and not thinking in terms of causes at all, because he was suspicious that the notion of a cause was not conceptually coherent. So there are lots of people who will say, don't talk about causes, don't talk about laws of nature. Think about how science operates and how the universe operates that science describes in other terms. The difficulty is it's not really clear where to turn. We think of the way science works as trying to find out what the best explanation of things is, And then you look for the topics that are worth thinking about and investigating. And in the process of doing that, you come up with explanations. The difficulty is that the notion of explanation and the notion of a cause are intimately connected. So if you give up the notion of causation when you're trying to describe how science works, you also have to give up the notion of explanation. So we're not going to go down that path here. I just wanted to register that there are people who think in this way, and it may be worth thinking about what you're going to do with science and its operations if you give up on the notion of causation. Similarly, with the notion of laws of nature. Some people will say this is just an interesting metaphor derived from a time when people thought the universe was created and governed by a divine being, God, so that the laws of nature were things that were divine laws. God created the universe and established principles according to which it operates. If you abandon this religious or supernatural perspective, perhaps the right thing to do is to figure out how to talk about all of this without talking about laws of nature. For our purposes, though, let's start with laws of nature. What is a law of nature? Going back to Hume, Hume thought of laws of nature in a very deflationary way. Laws of nature, according to Hume, were just regularities, the way things go. Hume also thought that's what causation involved. It involved one thing regularly following another thing. It is, after all, as much a regularity as the first one. There are other difficulties with regularity accounts of laws of nature. So we're not going to presuppose the Humean account of laws of nature. It does raise an interesting question, though, about what a law of nature really is. If we're going to describe a miracle as a violation of a law of nature, we better have a clear idea of what a law of nature is in the first place. Moreover, we better be clear that there really are such things as laws of nature. You can't understand what a miracle is in terms of a fiction. So we need to know what are laws of nature and are there some? Let's move past that issue, though, and just assume, yes, there are laws of nature. We're not quite clear how to describe them at this point, but there are such laws of nature, and let's suppose there is a decent account somewhere to be found. The second conceptual element here is the notion of a violation of a law of nature. What is a violation? The first thing that might come to mind, it is in fact the first thing that comes to my mind, is that a violation is just a counterexample. So if you have, suppose you have a law of nature and its form is all x's are y's. In order for it to be more than a mere regularity, maybe you need some sort of necessity or propensity or something stronger than mere regularity in the sentence itself. But the law of nature just links x's and y's. So at a minimum, whatever a law of nature is, it implies that all x's are y's. So what's a counterexample to all x's or y's? It is an instance where you have x, but you don't have y. That's a counterexample. So you might think a violation of a law of nature is just a counterexample to the universal generalization implied by a law of nature. That would be a distressing outcome. Here's why. One of the most fundamental aspects of modal logic is the following necessitation principle. If something is necessarily true, it's true. Actual truth follows immediately and directly from necessary truth. You don't want to have an account of a law of nature where it has to violate this fundamental axiom of modal logic. Whatever laws of nature are, they are necessary in some sense or other. If you then say A violation of a law of nature is a counterexample to it. You're committed to denying this fundamental principle of modal logic. You probably should look elsewhere. You need a different account of a violation of the law of nature to avoid this kind of conceptual tension in your system. If you're inclined to think miracles just can't happen, this might be an attractive view for you to try to defend. Yeah, a miracle is a counterexample to a law of nature, and that's why they can't occur, because there can't be counterexamples to something that's necessary. Think about what the word necessary means. It's either necessary or it's not. So if it's necessary, it has to happen. And so whatever regularities are implied are going to be regularities that don't have counterexamples to them. Miracles then could not happen. The problem is there's a weaker account of what a violation is that makes more sense of the possibility of there being miracles. So think about it this way. We have special sciences, and then we have quite generic general sciences. However you decide to carve that up doesn't really matter, but biology is a special science, psychology is a special science, sociology is a special science. Each of the special sciences have their own bevy of laws, or at least they're looking for laws. Maybe they haven't found any decent ones yet, but that's what they're trying to find. So you're trying to look for laws that govern the relevant systems. In doing so, you abstract from the underlying systems that are presupposed by your investigation of this system. So if you're investigating science of human behavior, thought, and action, you're doing psychology. You are presupposing various things about biology because one of the features about human beings is that they count as animals. So biological aspects are present all the time, but you abstract from those in order to investigate a subsystem of the organisms in question. You then develop laws. In doing so, you are presupposing that there's no untoward intrusion into the system from lower levels. So lower levels for psychology would include, first of all, biology. Biology relies on chemistry, and chemistry relies on physics. So you're assuming that there's no weird stuff going on in the more specialized regions from what's going on at the presupposed or more fundamental scientific levels. How does that work? Well, if you're thinking about human behavior, you're thinking about various inputs into a human person. Could be non-human, but let's just talk about human persons. You're thinking about actions that result, thoughts, speech patterns, all those sorts of things as outputs. What are the relevant inputs? Well, other beliefs, desires, that sort of thing that are in the head of the person in question. The experiential inputs that come through the senses. Various other sorts of stimuli from the surrounding environment. So then you give summaries of what you expect to happen in terms of laws of behavior. First of all, kinds of laws for psychology are the laws of psychology. Here's what they look like. You take a certain belief-desire complex that's in a person, and you can predict the behavioral outcome for that person. So if you believe such and such and you desire so and so, here's what you're going to do. Okay, once we have a law like that, those laws turn out not to be real laws, but they're good stand-ins at the beginning of our investigation. So suppose one of them were a real law. Here's something that can happen. You have a certain belief-desire complex, and you don't behave as the theory predicted you behave. Why not? Well, suppose you're John Kennedy, you're in Dallas, it's November 22nd, 1963, and you just got shot in the head. It's obvious your behavior is not going to be responsive to the belief-desire complex that the theory predicts. But this isn't a counterexample to the law of nature from folk psychology. It is a violation of that law, but it's not a counterexample to it. Because the law has an unexpressed ceteris paribus clause built into it. So the idea is, in the special sciences, your laws are of the form, if such and such is the case, and there's no intrusion from lower systems that are relevant to this special system, then you're going to get the following outcome in the special system itself. So a belief, desire, folk psychological explanation has an unexpressed ceteris paribus clause, and assassinations count as intrusions from lower level systems. A bullet to the brain is not a psychological event. It has psychological consequences, but the science of psychology doesn't need to formulate its laws and principles to take account of this kind of intrusion. So one way to think about violations of laws of nature is that laws of nature are, as David Armstrong says, oaken rather than iron. Oak is very hard, difficult to bend, but nothing like iron. So iron laws are ones that can't have any intrusions at all into their operation. Oaken laws are ones that have or can have ceteris paribus clauses that can undermine the link that the law establishes, but not in a way that counts as a counterexample. If there are such things as iron laws, they can't have counterexamples to them because an iron law can't have a ceteris paribus clause in it. Everything relevant has to be explicitly stated in the antecedent without some hand-waving reference to lower-level systems of some other sort. Given this distinction between iron and oaken laws, it turns out that only the most fundamental of sciences could be ones where iron laws are found. So let's suppose that's physics. That's the most likely one. For every other science, chemistry, biology, the social sciences, everything else, the laws in question will be oaken laws. When we get to the level of physics, should we say the same thing? Or should we say, this is bedrock. There can't be any intrusion from outside the system because we're at the bottom of all systems that comprise the universe. You should hear this remark as an affirmation of physicalism or materialism or naturalism. If physicalism, materialism, or naturalism is true, whatever the differences are between those three positions, we don't need to investigate right now. If one of those is true, or if all of them are true, and physics is fundamental, then there is nothing more fundamental, and so there can't be any intrusions at the level of physics from outside the system, because it is bedrock. On the other hand, if theism is true, or some non-physical picture of the universe is true, there might be supernatural things. There might be things that don't count as part of the natural world. And hence you might think, even if you're at fundamental level for science, which is physics, let's say, you still have to formulate the laws with ceteris paribus clauses, and that leaves the possibility of violations of laws of nature that are not counterexamples. Because a violation of a law of nature is one where the ceteris paribus clause is violated. All else is not equal. There is intrusion from outside the system. And so you don't get a counterexample to a law because, remember, the universal generalization will say, if something is an X and all else is equal, then that thing is Y. If all else is not equal, you don't get a counterexample because the antecedent is not satisfied in that case. So if we think about violations of laws of nature in terms of ceteris paribus clauses and the distinction between iron and oaken laws, we can avoid having to think about miracles as counterexamples to laws of nature. So let's understand a violation in terms of the distinction between iron and oaken laws to avoid conceptual incoherence. It's always a good thing to do. We're still not done, though. perhaps there's more to a miracle than being a violation of a law of nature. On this score, I want you to listen to Samuel Clarke, one of the early people discussing the nature of miracles. Here's what he says. In 1719, from Samuel Clarke, the true definition of a miracle in the theological sense of the word is this, that it is a work effected in a manner unusual or different from the common and regular method of providence, by the interposition either of God himself or of some intelligent agent superior to man, for the proof or evidence of some particular doctrine or in attestation to the authority of some particular person. Notice how it began, though. It began with this, the true definition of a miracle in the theological sense of the word. I'm not sure what Clarke has in mind here. What I am pretty confident about is that you shouldn't be positing ambiguity unless you need to. So maybe there are some miracles that aren't religiously significant, and maybe there are some miracles that are religiously significant. That doesn't mean the two different kinds of miracles don't have a common nature. It just means there's two different kinds of things. That's a relatively common phenomenon. So let's assume he's not talking about positing ambiguity, but he's just describing what the notion of a miracle is. Maybe what he thinks is a miracle by its very nature is a religiously significant event. So, for example, suppose you have a magician, Merlin. Let's make Merlin be a magician who has really special powers, powers that are going to count as supernatural ones. So he can hold out his wand and hex things, and in hexing things, they come to have features that they didn't have before, and there's no natural explanation that can be given to them. So the hexing by Merlin counts as a violation of the law of nature. It's an intrusion into a physical system from something beyond that system, even at the most fundamental level of physics. Clarke might say, well, that's not a miracle. There's no special religious significance to be attached to that at all. Hume could say, that's not a reason to think it's not a miracle. That's an interesting debate. It's worth thinking about and pursuing independently if you're interested in it.